Hello, this is Graphic Policy Radio, a podcast at the intersection of science fiction comics and movements for social change. This is your host, Ilana Levin. Today, we get to live where fantastic worlds meet our own because this isn't just any episode of the show. Today, you are being initiated into Project Fulcrum. For anyone less steeped in Star Wars lore, a fulcrum is a title used in Star Wars for folks who gather intelligence and recruit new members to join the rebellion against the Empire. I'm partnering with Get Free, which is a movement of Gen Z and millennials working for repair, real equality, and true freedom from white supremacy. They have pods across the U.S. organizing young people and you across race and place towards this goal. And we are in full-on Andor mode. Andor Season 2 has begun. And this is an opportunity for us to do what we call fan organizing, which is fans organizing through the story of stories we love and in the fan communities that we spend our social time in. And the Star Wars visionary behind Project Fulcrum is joining me today. Anthony Vidal Torres is the communications director for Get Free. He's a messaging specialist, political analyst, and organizer from Long Island, New York, who has supported winning progressive campaigns across the U.S. and abroad. He's been an avid Star Wars fan for as long as he can remember, from playing Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2 with his brother to watching Ahsoka grow into the leader we know and love. The stories from the galaxy far, far away are a key reason why Anthony believes in the power of hope, the power of people, and the power of action to change our reality. Welcome to the show, Anthony.
Wow, thank you so much, Alana. I'm so excited to be here talking about Project Fulcrum.
I was so glad when you reached out to say, like, we should do something around Andor. And I'm like, yes, we should. And that thing actually ended up being the kind of fan organizing work that I think people need to be doing if we want to have a victory in the real world. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what Project Fulcrum is?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you and so many other folks joined our team behind Project Fulcrum. As you mentioned, places like the Star Wars fan community are where so many of us make meaning, make relationships, and discuss not just what's happening inside the world of these stories, but how they relate to what's going on in our real world. And so, for many of us, Star Wars was our first introduction to the idea of resistance to fascism in fiction, even if we didn't know it at the time.
Mhm.
And while certain parts of this fandom have always discussed the political ramifications of Star Wars, Andor's first season kicked that into overdrive. And so many fans, whether they were new or had already been fans of this galaxy far away, felt galvanized by this message. And so for Get Free, we are an organization that for the last year and a half has been organizing young people to ultimately make freedom and equality real, to advance and mainstream reparations, and to fight this white supremacist faction that is right now running the MAGA regime and wielding their power to rule over us. And so this moment with Andor season 2 just seemed like the absolute critical time for us to get into conversation with all these folks who are worried about what's happening in our country and who care about all the things that are coming up in Andor as a show, and give them a way to be in community and take action. So Project Fulcrum is for any Andor fans who want to get involved and want to translate all of the passion they have for this show into changing the country that is not so far away.
I love this so much. You know, when I was covering season 1, I would have dreamed to be able to do something like this now. So thank you for making it real. And speaking of our season 1 coverage, I have returning to the show the Star Wars Jedi Master who has taught me so much about the series, who is single-handedly responsible and or guilty for getting me to actually return to the fandom of my earliest childhood memories. And that is Klaudia Amenábar. Klaudia is the co-host of Mystery Spotcast, but Star Wars fans know her as co-host of Rue Palp's Pod Race. and creator of Tarkin Talk. She's been in the trenches of Star Wars TikTok, Twitter, Tumblr for as long as she's had internet access and has been a Star Wars fan even earlier. She's been organizing fandoms with campaigns like Nerds for Her, hashtag SW Rep Matters throughout her entire career as a critic and social media strategist. And currently, she produces the Anime by the Numbers newsletter on Substack and has been working on Project Fulcrum. Welcome back to the show, Klaudia.
Hi, thanks for having me back. I have so many things to say about Andor since we haven't been covering it weekly with Brewhouse Padres. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited to be able to talk about it here.
Oh, that's amazing. Yes, I would definitely say to folks that this is going to be an entirely full of spoilers coverage of the first 6 episodes of season 2. And we will not be talking about season 1 because we covered it so thoroughly and well during this series' last appearance. I got to speak to Klaudia as well as my friend, student of many revolutions and uprising, Charles Lenchner. We had 2 episodes covering that season. I would definitely say to folks, if you haven't listened to the show before, to go check those out to sort of get the framework we're operating from. But let's dive into this series right now. So season 2, episode 1, 1 year later, starts with one of the most powerful scenes in Andor. I mean, honestly, one of the most powerful scenes I've seen in TV these days. Nia, a young Imperial defector, is taking the bravest step of her life in helping Cassian steal an experimental TIE fighter. And she asks him, how does she know that the risks she's taking, how does he know too, like that the risks she's taking are worth it? And he just looks right at her and says, this makes it worth it. This, right now, being with you, being here at the moment you step into a circle. Look at me. You made this decision long ago. The Empire cannot win. You'll never feel right unless you are doing what you can to stop them. You are coming home to yourself. You've become far more than you fear. Let that protect you. Would love to hear you guys reflect on that. Anthony?
I know that gave me chills right at the start of this new season. I think that that exchange between those two at the beginning, it really shows the importance to me of humanizing each other within this fight where we're often having to fight for our humanity from opponents who want to dehumanize a race and
Mm,
destroy us. In a lot of the organizing we all do, we know how important it is to build real relationships with each other, to connect with each other as people, to translate the passion we have for the cause into a deep compassion to one another. And so I think in that moment, I really felt her. It's scary
mhm,
to take action. It's scary, of course, in the with the stakes that they're facing in that moment, even scarier. And for Cassian to level with her and to just be like, hey, all these feelings are real. And this is why I'm doing this. This is why I've been taking action, why it's worth it. And, ultimately that is the type of leadership we need to be sharing with anyone who joins the cause. Is like, hey, here's the reality of
mm.
what we face, and here's why we're still taking action, and here's why we're going to support each other in doing it.
Claudia? I think that's a pretty big part of the second batch of episodes that came out last night as well, Anthony,
Mm,
because the main conflict between Luthen and Cassian is Luthen being like, we got to do what we got to do. And Cassian being like, okay, well, let's think about the real human cost of relationships in the middle of this. Like, let's have some perspective in that case. And I like how the show isn't really presenting either one as correct or wrong or whatever, but saying like these are real considerations that have to be made. And I mean, obviously the tragedy in this is that, we're seeing Cassian towards the early parts of the rebellion. And then when we see him towards Rogue One, he is cold and closed off. But yeah, what Anthony was saying of like, it is very scary. And what is the human connection there? And I think a very big strength of the show is that they're able to drop those just when you think things are going to get really, really, really bleak. The show is able to drop in those little moments of humanization. Like I was thinking about Clea and Luthen walking out of the party and them just being like, I wish I just killed Krennic there. And I was like, yeah, I may or may not have had a conversation like that with some of my friends for legal reasons. That's a joke. Or that kind of thing. Like, it's very good with that balance.
mm. And I was so struck by his kindness and empathy in that moment and how he emphasized that being able to nurture her into the rebellion is what he gets out of it, and that, like, making her feel meaningful in that way. Also, shout out to what I think we've confirmed was, like, the first young, attractive fat woman in Star Wars.
I literally said that. I literally said that when it was airing. I was like, "Oh, oh my god, we did it, Joe!" Like,
I mean, and, like, Star Wars has had tendency, like many, many media, not unique, to associate being heavy with being evil, which is just so effed up. So I was like, our new hero in so many ways. So good on her, Nia. You're fabulous. We love you. And, I think it's such a strong contrast to something we see in episode 3, I think, which is the wedding of Mon Mothma's reactionary daughter. And I'm grateful to Mon that her daughter wants to do this terrible stuff, so that way Mon doesn't have to be the one to tell her she has to do it in the name of rebellion. I actually don't think Mon would make her. She's not that kind of person. But all of the sort of visual metaphors that we get from the wedding about cutting ties to your family, to join a different one, and signing yourself over basically to be chattel in a new household. Maintaining this old tradition that is kind of, let's be honest, empty, sexist, regressive. And we didn't have a ton of Chandrilan lore, I don't think, prior to the series. Stop me if I'm wrong. So the invention of it having it be a whole thing where she talks about stepping into the circle. Cassian says the same thing to Nia, like that she's stepping into a circle. And it's like, well, which circle is it going to be? Is it a circle of regressive, oppressive, like, but you get lots of pretty
Right.
clothes, or I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Oof. I mean, I'm so here for the Mon Mothma arc
Mm.
that we never had, and now we're really getting, along with Bix's arc this season. Yeah, oh, the circles, the duel of the circles. I think in season 1, they reference quite a bit that some of these more unequal and hierarchical traditions are that the empire is actively stoking them and bringing them back. There's some evidence, I believe, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in season 1, there's some mentions that, like, Mon Mothma was like, "Oh, even when I was younger and becoming a senator, like, this was in the Republic, like, this was old shit."
Mhm,
And
mhm.
now with the Empire, and then she says in season 2, "What's old is new again." And, I mean, if a lot of our viewers here in the US, or listeners, sorry,
Mhm, mhm, yeah.
um, are probably like, "Yeah, wow, all this 16, 17, 1800 style white supremacy ideology. Oh, what's old is new again. Actually, what's old was always still here. We never fully reckoned with it." And so
Mhm.
it is, and it has a purpose. It reinforces the inequalities we see here and in the empire. So I found that super interesting.
I feel like the show starts with the Republic performing colonialism on Cassian's planet, and then when we had Saw's speech in this most recent one, where he was talking about the things he experienced, technically it was the Separatists, but it was funded by Palpatine, whatever. But that was all the way back in the Republic about that idea, Anthony, of these problems started before our current iteration of empire because it was kind of a fucked up colonial power the entire time. A thing Star Wars
Mhm.
fans never really want to talk about. But I really do appreciate the show's willingness to get into the nuances of that, almost to the point where Star Wars fans are like, "Huh?" all the time. Like, I feel like Tony Gilroy and Beau Willimon are, like, 100 steps ahead of them sometimes. It's almost too good.
It's a really good thing you mentioned because I think one of the sagas that we're gonna see unfold is Mon Mothma is truly visionary and someone who really models, like, actually caring about people, but one of the challenges that she has is it seems like she thinks there can be a restoration of the old republic, and I think she will see over time that that is not a possible thing to do or have happen, and, stories like those you just pointed to, I think, show that that's, like, not something we actually want.
Yeah, it's funny because it ties to a lot of my issues with other Star Wars shows that try to cover politics, like The Mandalorian season 3 and
Mm.
whatever about the politics of the New Republic that I just felt were very half-baked. Like, there is an idea there, like you just said, about, you know is the Republic something worth restoring? Is it a project worth restoring? And that's like an essential part of the politics of the New Republic and about like neo-fascism, the equivalent of neo-Nazis, the First Order, whatever, that era of Star Wars has not been very equipped to cover in a way, which makes seeing it all the way back in this era in Andor very interesting.
And I will say, I have no time for fans who joke about Mon Mothma as being like Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi, because unless those women are doing some things that we have never heard of, no, she's not. This
I
is an
wish.
this is an actual class traitor, actually. So yeah.
I mean, I want to roll with Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, Padme Amidala. I mean, that would be my crew, if I was in the Senate. And the clothes, look, be
Yeah.
Yes, the
be a
clones
class,
are
be
the
a cl-
proletariat. The clones are the
yeah,
the
yeah,
clones are the
exactly. Be a
proletariat.
class traitor with style.
Yes.
But I think what I would also add, it's interesting, right? Because the formal name of the Rebel Alliance is the Alliance to Restore the Republic.
Mhm.
And it's interesting to me, too, how Saw Gerrera in one of the latest episodes talks about how they may never be able to see the Republic back again, but, they'll die fighting. It's interesting also hearing that from him, who
Mhm.
seems to have a very different praxis evolving.
I was thinking the same thing, Anthony. I was like, "Oh, okay, he's still down with the Republic, okay."
That was
Yeah,
surprising.
yeah.
I wanna talk about Saw Gerrera extensively in a little bit, but I wanna stay a little bit grounded right now still in the beginning of the season, where we have some absolutely ripped from the headlines, but also ripped from the headlines of the past present as well. Look at the existence of Cassian's found family living as undocumented farm labor workers, having to stay ahead of ICE. I'm sorry, I'm hearing that they're supposed to call them, the Imperials, but it's ICE. It's ICE. It was such a wonderful decision to literally place that storyline in an agricultural planet where it's been straight up spelled out to us that the Empire depends on the grain harvest of this planet. The grain harvest depends on undocumented labor, and the government is rounding up undocumented labor. Let's talk about it.
Oof, there's so much to say here. It really, watching that and even hearing them use the language of undocumented and then, of course,
Mhm.
by Imperials and the like, using illegal and other terms. Thinking about how, yeah, the Empire, just like real life regimes, relies upon, two things. One is creating a permanent underclass of people by, in this case, making undocumented people, among other groups, denying them rights in order to force them to produce what the regime requires. And the second thing is this serves a divide and conquer strategy of
Mm.
dividing up working people by the powerful few so that they can always blame a them, and other, in this case, undocumented immigrants, people seeking asylum, what have you, blame them for the inequalities that the regime created in the first place. So when I was watching that episode, I was like, oh, all right, now we're seeing under the hood how the empire
Mm.
maintains public support, maintains the exploitive economic system it needs to sustain itself.
It's something that I admire, especially about this show, is how unflinching they are about using, like, the terms, like,
Mm.
sometimes, like, I know some people will say, like, "Oh, it's a little too on the nose," and I'm like, I think, unfortunately, we do need on the nose, so they use the word they don't make up a Star Wars word, they use the word undocumented.
Yeah.
Even in the episodes last night, instead of saying stormtrooper, they said soldier, which I thought was really impactful, like,
Mm.
very real, and made it quite controversial, like, they use the word illegal, they use the word undocumented. When, what's his name? Cyril. I call him Cyril because he's funny. When Cyril is pretending to be, rebel adjacent for Deidre's insurgency plan, and he's joking with his mom about how, Fox News, sorry, the Imperial HoloNet, is, oh, that's just propaganda. Like, they're saying the words outright that we say day to day. And I
Mm.
know that Tony Gilroy has said, this isn't just me pulling from now, this is me pulling from a lot of history. You could place this at any point, which is the kind of the sad part. But I appreciate that, like, being very explicit with it, and, like, what Anthony said and Yolanda said about how, like, they specifically put it in this agrarian context and that they need these certain resources, and they're saying it out loud. The show is able to do something of saying something extremely on the nose, almost smacking you on the head with it without it being obnoxious in a way that is very hard to do.
Something that was subtle that I wanna make sure people notice, though, is when I'm forgetting his name, but when the local farm cooperative guy who had been sort of helping them keep abreast with where the Imperials were and all that, when the Imperials show up at that guy's house and they're trying to arrest and detain Brasso, etcetera, Brasso was like, "Oh, you turned us in, you bastard." That man didn't turn them in. Brasso was helping to cover for the
Right.
fact that the man had supported them, and I think some fans didn't quite catch the eye exchange between the 2 men that were like, "No, he's just trying to help this man not get in the shit just because he got in the shit." And I think that points to something that was the call to action in the most recent issue of Nemec's Weekly Manifesto, which is a newsletter that if you sign up for Project Fulcrum, you can receive in your inbox a free newsletter that will break down the themes of the show, give you some reading material and some listening material and some real life calls to action. Anthony, can we talk about this week's call to action from that?
Yeah, yeah. So from last week's Nemec's
Yes.
manifesto, we had several resources in there and ways that you can take action right now here in the US on the exact topic we're discussing with this episode. So one of the ways was demanding that lawmakers protect student protesters like Mahmoud Khalil and so many others who have been kidnapped and abducted by ICE for speaking truth to power. So we have in there a very easy link where you can tell your member of Congress to stand for our freedom to protest and to stand for demanding freedom for all of these folks who've been taken from us. And in addition to that, we also shared from a partner organization of ours, shout out to United We Dream, a Know Your Rights guide that also is included with various different languages that you can read and you can share with your friends and family about what to do and how to prepare for when the empire, aka ICE, shows up unannounced. So those are some of the examples of the types of calls to action we'll be including in our weekly manifestos from Nemec, and we'll talk a bit later about the one for this week.
Yay.
And one thing about that I thought was interesting was, like, obviously they wrote and directed and shot these episodes of the first batch before, Trump came back into office and before all of the ICE crackdowns on pro-Palestinian protesters. And I think one interesting thing is that Cassian's family, Bix, Brasso, B2E, Mel, Wilmon, all of them, they are undocumented and they're on the run because they were protesters, because they participated
Mhm.
in the Ferrix riot. And it was eerily prescient that, like, and they weren't being chased down because of that. It was a routine imperial inspection to find anybody, but, like, they were being swept up in this, and I feel like it goes back to that idea that we were talking about earlier about how, this has existed longer than the Trump administration and the empire ICE has existed since the Bush administration. That, all different kinds of people are gonna get swept up. It's not just undocumented people, it's going to be protesters, it's going to be all kinds of stuff, and it was weirdly prescient to watch that they just predicted this hook, line, and sinker as it was happening. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, wear a mask when you go to a protest. I feel like that was an overlying thing when, like, these people, they're running because they could be identified by the empire, and then Cassian is feeling has major PTSD and doesn't wanna get recognized by cameras and stuff. I'm like, "Wear a mask."
Well, I mean, and in real life right now, what I would be doing if I wasn't talking with you guys is we have a phone bank asking New Yorkers to, in this case, we is Jews for Mask Rights, have a phone bank asking New Yorkers to call their state senator and state assembly member saying not to ban masks in New York because people shouldn't be forced to get COVID. Like, it's just like, this is our reality right now. Happy to share links on that, but they're trying to ban masks all over the country for forced making everybody sick and to expose everybody to extra scrutiny by the state. Something that I think thematically connects this season to last season is the farmer was saying, like, somebody has to tell someone what's going on here. And Brasso emphasizes that it's happening everywhere. And this is the same thing that Melchi from, who's the other guy who escaped from Narkina 5 last season, says to Andor about what happened in the prison. And while, yes, what happened in the prison is spectacular in such a way that, no, really, somebody needs to tell somebody. I think sort of a default human response to the horror is that, like, somebody needs to say something. And then the question is, like, to who and to what outcome for it. That's certainly one of the divisions in strategy we see now between the Gorian front and their strategy and the strategy that Andor himself is suggesting for them. He doesn't see a point at this point in them trying to expose something that he assumes everybody else can already see.
Which I found I was just gonna mention the Gorman front thing. The one thing that a lot of fans have been hoping would be mentioned in this season because it every 3 episodes, it skips 1 year, in this 4-year period up until the Battle of Yavin,
Mhm.
is something from Rebels. I know every time we talk about this show, I talk about Rebels because
There's a
this show
reason.
and yeah, this show and Rebels, I feel like, are in conversation with each other. I mean, down to the Gorman thing, they're in conversation with each other. And one thing is that we find out that Ezra, the main character of Rebels' parents, their whole thing was that they broadcast rebel propaganda from Lothal. And one of the first things that Ezra does as a rebel himself is broadcast on that channel to get the news out there about something. And there's another plot line with a senator, whatever, in Rebels about how they're trying to get certain information out there. And that's like a big thing. And it's like, and what do people do with that information? And there's been a lot of people saying, like, I hope we get to hear Ezra's broadcast from Lothal at some point. I think by this point, it may have already happened in the timeline. So we may have missed the boat on that. But there's this question of how do we get the information out there? And then what do people do with it? Which I think really relates to a lot of what we're doing or a lot of what happens in real life is like, okay, we're doing a lot of educating people. So now what do we do about it? And that inner conflict. Um, as many a meme has said about about this show, leftist infighting simulator kind of thing.
Oh, let's hop over to that for a second, if you don't mind. At first, I was a little bit irritated that the conflict that we saw in the initial leftist infighting on the planet was over just literally people being idiots, but actually that's important representation too. Anthony, if you want to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, yeah. At first, it's just like this mess that we see, right? What we now know as Yavin 4. Yeah, just bunch of idiots
Inadequately
arguing,
trained, you know?
inadequately trained and supported. Exactly. And I think that goes into this deeper point of like, really, that whole arc to me felt like it was really hitting hard on the need for leadership. The need for
Mm.
leadership, it was the need for trust. And what we saw there was, as one of our favorite Star Wars creators, Mesa Windu, put out recently on their YouTube, the tyranny of leaderlessness. And that ultimately what we need and want for movements is to be leaderful. And that means developing each other's leadership, but also holding our roles and being clear about calls to action, who's making calls, and ultimately being responsible for a plan. And in this case, what we saw was, mainly dudes
Mm.
vying for leadership over ego rather than over a real plan. And, I think that it was sort of this analogy for this larger problem. I think that they're going to go deeper into in this season of the need for trust in order for the
Mm.
rebellion to grow as a movement across the galaxy, and the need for there to be real leaders and developing people's leadership so that people are taking full responsibility for their role and carrying out a plan to its fruition.
And what a kind of a leader it is because, like, Cassian is being pushed by Luthien to think like a leader, but to Luthien,
Right.
thinking like a leader means sacrificing people because you have a plan
Right.
to polarize the galaxy, which is probably not sustainable, is an argument that we sort of Cassian doesn't articulate it yet, but I suspect he may get there. It's certainly Mon Mothma is all about, like that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it incredible writing that Cassian's whole thing is, they're rushing, they're not thinking, they're not, using proper leadership or training or that kind of thing. And Luthen is the one who is normally the one to say that, is the one going, rush in, whatever. It's dramatic irony at its best. And we know most likely Luthen is dying because he's not a character who shows up in the Rebellion or Rogue One later. And Cassian is a fulcrum and a spoke of rebel intelligence. So, and I've seen a lot of people talking about Luthen's pride before the fall kind of thing, but he's falling into the same stuff as some of like the Gorman rebels and that kind of thing of we need to rush. I almost feel like and it's ironic because they're all fighting about the same things, but so they all fall into the same pit. It reminds me a lot of like real life, like leftist accelerationists who are like, well, when the revolution
Yeah.
comes, and we're like, well, that's not really how it works in the sense that kind of thing. It feels very much like, leftist shit posters on Twitter who it's like, okay,
Mhm. Mhm.
like when the revolution comes, okay, sure, let's do some actual work.
Like this is Santa Claus who's someday going to
Exactly, exactly, and they fall into it, but the Gorman rebel, the daughter of the guy saying, like, "It's really hard to have that patience and have that thing
Mhm.
when you're desperate," and I really do like that the show was able to have that compassion on the other side.
That's true. I mean, ultimately, the conflict between Luthien and Andor over how to handle the Gorman situation is that Cassian is approaching it from a standpoint of how and if can I help the Gorman people free themselves from the Empire? And he doesn't see how that's possible given their circumstances. And Luthien does not actually care or think that Gorman can be freed. He sees a world that is positionally high profile and that polarizing it, even if it means also getting it destroyed, will be useful for the messaging of polarizing the other planets of the world to see how evil the Empire is, which is sort of like, that's some tanky accelerationist shit. And like, we should have a conversation about like, and I'm not like I love all of these characters. They're all bringing so much important stuff to the story. These were amazing performances, but that doesn't mean that I think everybody represented is like, and they're all doing something useful in telling this conflict. But like, you know, I don't think it's quite right to say, oh, I'm an XYZ identifying person about a particular character because they all kind of exist in dialogue with each other, which is the point of the show.
Yeah, and then I wanna bring Mon back in, my girl
Mhm.
Mon, because she then represents sort of another pole in this, right? Like, she's coming in and saying, "Hey, I wanna check in with this person because I care about them." I think in that case, she was referring to her cousin.
Mhm.
And she also mentions in a recent episode that we need to live, not just survive in order to win. And so that is a strength, I think, as I see of her leadership style that now
Mhm.
to me makes a lot of sense about why ultimately she becomes sort of the political leader of the alliance going forward and sort of takes on the mantle. It sort of fills in for me what we don't fully get from a lot of other expanded universe content about Mon Mothma's leadership. But now I fully see how she took up the baton from Bail Organa and Padme Amidala, that lineage. But the thing that she's growing into, speaking of that lineage, is she's growing into the need to take action and sometimes take bold action, and the importance of the outside game and not just focusing on the inside. In this
Mhm.
latest episodes,
Mhm.
one of the things I was so frustrated with was in her lobbying other senators, etc. She's using all these facts and stats and just trying, really relying on just her own skill in persuading and winning an argument over another senator. When, if you look at the balance of power, girl, this is why you need the rebellion. This
Yeah.
is why you need the people power on the outside. This is why you need real leverage over these senators if their votes, in this case, even matter.
Right,
So
that's
those are just
true.
all the growing edges we're seeing in the conflict between these characters.
Well, what was so amazing was the excuses that the other senators had for why they couldn't vote what we would consider to be the right way in the Senate about that bill is because they were buying into Emperor's propaganda about who is a criminal and what crime is, and she's like, "The stats are it isn't on the rise," and they're like, "Yeah, but it feels that way." And this is like straight up this conversations we're having within the Democratic Party right now about whether or not, we're going to defend undocumented people who are being put in concentration camps or not. Like Gavin Newsom is all like, "Oh, no, I think it's bad to go out there." Meanwhile, Van Hollen is like straight up, "I'm going to go to where this man is being imprisoned and, like, demand to see him." And what resonated more with the public in the end? Going and standing up for people. So, all of those really shitty senators are exactly like the really shitty Democrats in, like, literally to down to how they are talking about crime and how they are talking about whether or not standing on with the right, protecting marginalized people is expeditious or not. That was so apt. And even the senator from sorry, was it the senator from
The Gorman,
yeah,
the
sorry.
Gorman senator, I I
Mhm.
I was just gonna bring up the senator from Gorman, like, it very much gave, especially being like, a New York resident where you are supposed to be in a blue state where you have Democratic leaders fighting for you, and it's technically a very privileged place, like how they described Gorman, and you have these senators who they just flop over every single time. Like,
Yeah.
when people are like, "Contact your senators about, Palestine or whatever," and I'm like, "Well, I know Kristen Gillibrand is not gonna listen to me." Like, in
Oh,
that
I
moment, I
would
was laughing.
disagree. We have moved those people left on that over the course of my
True.
lifetime. Like, are they
True,
where they need to
true.
be? No, but, like, she wouldn't have moved at all if people hadn't been doing that this whole
Oh,
time.
true, but, like, it very much that scene very much felt like, "Oh, man, she's talking to Chuck Schumer." Like
Oh, yeah. Oh,
like,
yeah.
that's what that scene very much felt like, and it also felt very much like, we have all of these people in the government who are like, I don't know what we'll do, guys. I guess we'll just flop over for Doge and the Trump admin," and he just said it,
Mhm.
and it honestly, every time I see a scene like that, I'm like, "Damn, he got Disney to pay money for that. That's crazy."
And coming back to the whole thing of Mon's strategy here then and power,
Mhm.
it's like just like right now, we've had to push leaders to refuse to comply with the MAGA regime's attacks. In in this situation, I'm like, yeah, you need a movement, you need a rebellion, you need people across the galaxy pressuring those senators, Mon. They're not just going to
Mhm.
flip because you made a compelling argument or not to them. And I want to come back to one other thing because I was watching this and thinking, all right, Mon, but there's also more compelling arguments than these stats.
Mhm.
Because as you were saying, Alana, feelings ultimately devour facts in any debate. And what the fascists, the white supremacists, what the emperor in this case understands is that they want to make their ideas popular and common sense rather than allowing their beliefs or their desires or the truth to stand on its own. And so they created a story here. There's a whole narrative that the empire constructs to incite fear, anger, and hatred and division. But specifically what's highlighted here in these episodes is how around Gorman is
Mhm.
how the empire has created this very anti-Semitic propaganda against Gormans, as we heard from, you know, reflected and repeated by Serial's mother in one of those scenes.
Mhm.
And what we see is that, like, that story and the power that that has wielded to turn much of the galaxy against this planet that the Empire needs to devour itself, those senators feel that power. And whether or not they believe that story, they're making a calculation that, like, hey, right now, we need to hear a different story that actually people are willing to say and repeat that exposes what the actual motivations and the end game and outcome is here. Because right now, Mon, your stats are just bouncing right off the fact that the Empire is saying Gorman and the galaxy requires us to have a firmer hand and a crackdown.
And I think it's also interesting that we know, those of us who watch Rebels know the moment where Mon Mothma realizes what you're saying and is like, "No, so I fear that just convincing people with numbers isn't gonna work. I need to just leave," is tied to something that happens on Gorman. And when the Ghost Crew comes and picks her up and rescues her, something occurred with Gorman that made it so that she was no longer safe operating from the inside. And I think that's why this is so interesting, because we are watching the process of her realizing that, of other people realizing that,
Right.
of we're gonna need to do something bigger. And also the other thing of, even let's say even if she got all the votes, at the end of the day, the emperor still has absolute power.
Right, right.
That, like, yeah, you could do as much as you could from the inside, but at the end of the day, he could still do it with his military might, and that's something that eventually that they get to. And it's very true of, things like executive orders, or and people are like, "Oh, well, this is," we hear this all the time with the Trump administration, right? Of like, "Well, this is illegal and the court said this," or, thinking about the Iraq war or whatever, like, we haven't actually declared a war in Congress the way we're legally supposed to in decades, but the president sends them anyway. And then we have the Iraq war, or we're in Afghanistan, or we
Yeah.
have various other things. And it's very much this thing of, well, we might need to do something a little bit more direct. And it's very interesting to watch her, especially as a character, realize that happen in real time.
Um, the Gormans themselves, like literally the Gorman front members themselves, who are genuine. They're not like just all plants like Cyril is, misattribute the cause of their suffering. They think it's Tarkin. I understand why, because of what they survived. But they're
Mhm.
like, the ISB is running a shadow government. Even they don't want to say the Emperor did this.
I found that fascinating, especially because I just rewatched Revenge of the Sith, and you have to remember that the Emperor was, to most people's eye, the emperor was a liberal, in our terms, a liberal senator from Naboo who eventually becomes the chancellor. And then he's like, "Oh, look what the Jedi did to me in my face," and blah, 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 blah. And there's a lot of people who like the emperor but think the empire is bad. Like, that adds a level of nuance that I was like, "Oh, wow, they really went for it." Like, we know he's a Sith Lord, we know he's bad, but other people are like, "Oh, well, the Emperor is just like, he's a good guy, and like clearly the Empire is doing some bad shit." Like, to me, that reminds me very of like leopards eating their face, kind of like Trump
Oh,
supporters
yes. You
who are
hear
like,
that.
"Wait, well, I still like him, but like, girl, the tariffs," like that kind of thing. That was a crazy element to add.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting things with the Gorman front, who I love, by the way.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
love their, like, genuine commitment. They're fighting for their home, and you can really feel that, and their, commitment to each other. On this question of their strategy, there is this, as Cassian puts, there are a lot of questions with their strategy, and I, for one, think believe in the power of action. And so direct action allows us to expose and visibilize and bring to the surface problems and solutions. In their case, they articulate that their strategy is, if we expose that the Empire is building a armory on our planet, therefore, most people on Gorman, or more people in the galaxy, or the Senate, or the Emperor, it's unclear who the target fully is, will intervene. And the challenge that I see, though, is that they're not fully confronting, there's a couple missing pieces. Like,
Mhm.
and again, putting Luthen aside and his, like, sacrificial nature, because again, I think it's worthwhile for the Gormans to be taking action, but they need other things in their strategy. One, how are they going to counter and position a competing narrative
Mhm.
to the story that the Empire has put forth, that you need all these soldiers, you need all these armies, you need all this occupation for safety, because just exposing the armory is not going to just overcome that story. The Empire could use that to their advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing here is that, like, what's the so what at the end? If they are right, and most people already believe there's an armory, and most people are upset about that but are not taking action, we need more than just more harms and horrors to get more people into the movement. They need so what are we getting on the other side? What is the vision for Gorman? What are the solutions? How am I going to feel, taste, breathe on the other side of us demanding the removal of these weapons in the armory? And they don't quite have that because,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, they're like, okay, we're trying to figure out our villains. Maybe we want to get rid of this shadow ISB government and get a new government or new system for Gorman. But they haven't really articulated, like, what is the so what at the end? What's the positive outcome they want other than just the amelioration of harm from the Empire?
I think it really connects back to what Nemec said in the first season of, the Empire's strategy is 100 horrors in many different places, so that even if you expose this thing, it's like, okay, well, we know, like, what are we going to do about it?
Exactly.
And also the thing that then Brasso says at the beginning of this season, what his employer, the farmer, at the beginning of the season is like, someone has to know. And Brasso's like, they already do know. It's happening everywhere. And clearly the people in power know. When we see Mon having these conversations, she's like, look at what's happening. And they're all like, well, girl, don't know what we'll do about that. And it's very much, we're seeing the disconnect in this way in real time. And it's, again, I have to compliment the writers, is that not only do they show don't tell, they do both. They tell
Mm-hmm.
and they show.
Mm,
So they say that Mick says it, Brasso says it, whatever, and then they're like, okay, now we're gonna show you why that doesn't work, or that kind of thing. And I love how that connects to a problem we have in real life of people burying their head in the sand because the news just gets worse and worse, and the doom scrolling gets worse and worse, and they're like, I don't know how to ingest this much at once all the time. And so they become paralyzed by it. And so it again becomes this fight of narrative.
Yeah, Nemec's whole
yeah.
line about everything happening too quickly from
Yep.
last season is just constantly hammered home.
Yeah. And oh, this is why the writing is so good. I mean, and Luthen, in a way, is not fully wrong in his assessment, right? That there needs
Mm.
to be more bright lights in this dark galaxy, that there needs to be more people shining that light so that more and more citizens and beings of the galaxy are willing to take up the fight and see themselves as part of it. Like, he's not wrong and that there needs to be visible, powerful demonstrations of action. He's wrong about other things, about just like
Uh-huh.
sacrificing people, throwing spaghetti at the wall with that, and just like not caring for consequences. But I think what we're going to be on in this journey through this season is we're ultimately going to be getting closer and closer to the point of where the rebels, or certain rebels, learn that they need to give this aspirational rallying cry, and they need to show and tell
Mhm.
that the reasons why people should fight the empire and join the rebellion. Because by the original trilogy, as we get closer to there's masses and masses of people taking action. Right now we have such small numbers, so how do we get from BBY3 to there? I think that journey is going to be exposed here, about how, through all of their stories, about how do we ultimately inspire people to want to get involved and stay involved.
Speaking of, let's talk about Saw Gerrera now and his speech with poor captive Willimon. Who I'm so glad we still get to see him. But what a brutal place for a young man to have to find himself.
I Whenever Saw Gerrera appears in anything, I will always defend him. Sometimes I can't defend him, but I always defend him from very stupid Star Wars fans who don't understand him the way I understand him. Also, they were on the planet Jakar, which I just have to say, that is the planet that we see the Resistance in The Force Awakens, that we see Finn and Poe on. It is
Yep.
that same planet. I was like, hello, I see the reference.
They kept it. That means the rebels successfully held it. Mazel
Yeah, which
tov.
well, and I think in the movies or in the books at one point, they do say that the Resistance, when they end up finding the First Order, they go back and find old rebel strongholds that were abandoned, and then we see Saw's cell abandon this spot, which I thought was really cool. But I will always defend Saw Gerrera with my life. I will say, King, I love your monologue, but Willamon was trying to concentrate, so like
I
give your
know.
maybe don't give your recap of the Clone Wars for people who didn't watch the Onderon arc while he's trying to concentrate and not blow you all up. That being said, Beau Willimon, one thing that man can do is write a monologue. Everybody's got a great monologue in this series.
Mhm,
It's like
mhm.
it's
Yep.
just and Forrest Whitaker coming back to Star Wars and always giving these crazy monologues is just off the wall. And also, I saw a lot of people joking about this, but you see Luthen being like, "Hey, Bix, these sleeping meds might make you feel worse, and we need you at your best." And then on the other side, you see Saw Gerrera with Wilmon being like, "Huff the fumes." But and we're joking about that, but the message that they're trying to get across is that like different people's philosophies about rebellion come across in different ways. And the thing he says about how there are some people who are the fuel that ignites when something I can't remember the exact thing, but when the friction gets too bad, there are some people who are the fuel who ignites. And I thought that was really impactful. And the way that it connects also back to when we see Saw Gerrera in Rogue One again, he's wearing like a breathing mask, whatever, and
Mhm.
it is a physical and also symbolic representation of how he has been literally huffing the fumes of rebellion for so long that it is killing him.
Yes.
Oof.
And
Yeah.
and in the movie, he is supposed to be this parallel for Darth Vader, right? He has the same mask and that kind of thing. But then now in the show, we've added this element of like this is what it has made him, and he's one of the ones who survived
Right.
and that kind of thing, which I thought was it just crazy work, just crazy work. I did also love the moment where he shoots the other guy who was clearly an Imperial plant because
Was he
I
though?
I think he was. Like, yes, they do love to show Saw Gerrera as paranoid all the time, but I also do love to show when he's right.
It's hard for me to trust anything happening with that
I
crew
know,
over
which is
there.
Mhm.
so nice because I was it Tony Gilroy himself or somebody said that he was like, I feel bad for the Wikipedia editors because there's a lot of things that are up in a gray area, up in the air that we
God
don't know.
bless.
And you're like, "Oh, thank God for good storytelling," because there's sometimes you just don't know. There's so
Yes,
many things where you
yes.
go, "Who can say?" And that's on purpose. But I'm gonna choose to say that my boy Saw Gerrera was right because they always cast him as paranoid and crazy, but there are only 2 bitches who knew about the Death Star before BBY, and that was Thrawn and Saw Gerrera, so
True, true.
One other thing I think that I really appreciated, even though it was very hard to watch, for me at least, was diving into the reality of trauma, of coping, of addiction.
Mhm.
Because, yeah, unfortunately, with Bix, I think that they are worse than sleeping pills that she's taking in the apartment. And all of that is, real. The like
Yeah.
need to cope with all this violence, the lack of support. And this is a reality many of us are familiar with living in this world. And, I appreciate them delicately and carefully, I think, going about it. Though, yes, the fumes at the end, though metaphorically powerful, visually quite absurd a bit. I am very worried for our young man
Oh my god.
yeah, I was like,
who's
"Oh, Wilma,
yeah.
no."
I know, I was like, "Oh god."
The thing you brought up, Anthony, about showing different ways that trauma manifests and how we do it, I found it interesting that we see how Bix handles her trauma right next to how Cassian handles his, and his is
Mm.
through paranoia. Like, she's
Mm,
like, "Hey, we should be able to go to a store. That's a normal thing that normal people do. That's not like an OPSEC thing." And he's like, "I can't even go to the same bodega or else whatever." And she's like, "I need to have my regular bodega or else I'll die." Like, or that
yeah.
kind of thing
Yeah,
Yeah.
she
of like,
says I think she also says something like, "I can't sleep, he can't, like,
yeah, like
operate in the
Can't
his
go to
daily
the
world."
store. Yeah.
he has
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
he has extreme paranoia and she can't sleep. Obviously, Luthen is losing his mind. Um you have different people coping in different ways. Obviously, you have Saw, you have Mon
Mhm.
Mothma being like, "Well, guess I'll get drunk and party." Like,
Drinking and dancing.
yeah, she said recession pop is here to stay.
Oh.
You know, but, like, I found that really interesting of, seeing Cassian's trauma, and obviously we're seeing it over time because unfortunately everyone around him is going to die, and then we're seeing what's left of him in Rogue One,
Oof.
so
That's so real. But, like, I am so haunted by the scenes with Saw and our teenager, literal teenager Wilma.
Yeah, that closing scene really sticks with me. I think that Saw Gerrera in this story, and it goes back to a lot of the things we're talking about between Luthen, Saw, Cassian, Mon, I think is this dueling philosophies around how do we win? How do we fight and not just win? And is it about caring about people and picking our battles? Or is it about breaking our people even more in pursuit of victory? And yeah, I think those are just the really, really dark questions that we're left with at the end of this second arc.
And we know, I mean, I don't think Willamon is gonna be left standing, and I think that's awful and unnecessary. Again, this is not a critique of the story. This is a critique of the way things are handled in the world, and, like, people can't just be treated disposably like that, especially children. So, questioning everyone there. But speaking of young people and strategies they do or don't do, I wanna go back to Gorman real quick and talk about the strategy of the, Imperials against Gorman and about the Gorman Front's operation. I'm pretty sure that when we talked about Andor season 1 on our podcast, we shouted out the Joachim Miaville's, film Army of
I think we
Shadows
did. Yeah.
inspiration then, and boy, folks, go watch that movie. Bring some tissues, but go watch that movie because that was all over our Gorman scenes.
The whole time in Gorman, what was interesting to me, and I had mixed feelings about this, was that they were specifically speaking Gore the entire time, and I was like, "Are they just speaking French?" Because for some background about what Star Wars likes to do is sometimes they'll make up a conlang, a fictional language for something in Star Wars, and sometimes they'll just have an alien speak a real ass language from the global south or an indigenous language.
Mm.
They do it all the time. They've gotten better about it. At the beginning of this series, when they have Cassian, Casa, all of the scenes are in his native language and they're not translated. And I understand the storytelling reasoning for that. And that was that he doesn't remember his language anymore and these are his memories. And so they're not translated for us. In the end, it just felt very othering because in Star Wars, they have characters speak non-basic languages all the time. Basic is English in the galaxy, and they don't translate. They have someone translate for them, and it very much others those people. It others aliens and droids and that kind of thing. And it's like an ongoing problem. And I didn't know how I felt about that initially. And then they have Gorman, who are very much coded as French. They're coded as French, sometimes Eastern European, but mostly French in the sense that, like, oh, this is a very wealthy city that has to do with fashion. I was like, okay, Paris, that has to do with fashion and have a history of resistance. And the language is a lot like that, whatever.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
wearing berets. They're in outdoor cafes. I was like, oh, so this is Paris. Got it. And they translate their conlang in their language, and I was a little uncomfortable with that. But at the same time, I understood why it was done. And what I found interesting was that, I guess, big spoiler alert again, when we're talking about the tactics of the Gorman Front, one of the big things was that once Luthen sent in our lesbians Velcinta, rest in peace, our only on-screen
Mhm.
lesbian ship, but okay. Rest in peace. Their big thing was nobody here needs to have a weapon. We need to stay focused. The two of us will
Yes.
have weapons. And then one guy was haughty, didn't listen, had a weapon, and that resulted in Cinta's downfall. And whether or not we believe that that advice was right, it ties all back into that thing of like, we're not working together, we're not listening, we think we're better than each other, that kind of thing. And I found that to be really interesting that like she's not felled by the empire, she's felled by the rebellion's inability to listen to each other kind of thing in these early days. She's also felled by the fact that the actress needed to go work on Doctor Who, which I've seen her in the first few episodes, and I will say she's underutilized in Andor, and then she goes and stars in one of the best Doctor Who episodes I've seen in a while. So I'll let this one slide, even though it was a barrier gay situation.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let it slide this one time.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a meaningless. I mean, it was
No.
like
And it
as
wasn't
she's
gratuitous either,
Mhm.
which I appreciated.
And as she says to the rebel, I mean, like, you will carry this with you like skin. And like that's how Cinta became herself, was her own family being murdered by the Imperials.
Yep.
So it's like
Yeah.
that her legacy is continuing
Yeah.
through
Well,
this guy.
and
But
Vel basically saying to this guy of like, I hope you learn from this lesson. The biggest thing that she said was that, like, Cinta was everything that you wanted to be, that you
Mm.
admire in a rebel. And, not she was a soldier, she was a warrior, and like she was everything that you wanted to be, and you killed her because you're a stupid idiot was a crazy thing to say and a crazy thing to put in there that I felt was important that they said. And just to speak on the fridging thing, because I know everybody's gonna be talking about it, and as the co-host of a gay Star Wars podcast, I have to bring it up. But like I think this wouldn't hurt so bad if we had ever had any on-screen gay people in Star Wars
Yes.
before, because everybody in the show is dying. From the second we've met everybody, we're like, we know we're all dying, we're just waiting to see how. Um, Everybody in the show is dying. And so as soon as we met them, I was like, oh, so we're gonna have to watch them get fridged. I think it especially hurts because we see them kiss on screen, which is huge, huge, huge,
Yep.
huge,
Yep.
huge
Yep.
for Star Wars. And then immediately she dies, which sucks big time. And watching a character of color die while the white character doesn't happens a lot in fridging. So, like, I want to acknowledge that. It's just hard because it's like, well, this is the show where people die. We saw
Yeah.
Brasso die. Like, they don't care. Everybody's dying. And it kind of sucks that this is the only show where they gave enough of a fuck about gay people in the show where people are dying. But, so it's not Tony Gilroy's fault. It's more Lucasfilm's fault,
Yes.
in my opinion. Also, maybe if they had kissed in like season 1, I would have been okay with it.
I co-sign everything you said.
Yeah, so one thing I want to flag for our listeners, especially our regular Star Wars fans, is the same MAGA faction that throughout many other Star Wars shows and media outside of this fandom, the same faction that finds something in a show, such as, in this case, a lesbian relationship, or having prominent Black and brown people, et cetera, to turn people against this show and ultimately turn towards what this supremacist vision that this faction promises. They're going to do the same thing with Andor. And when I
Mhm.
saw that scene, and I was very glad to see the powerful relationship between these two women in the show, I was just thinking that, the real life Imperials really want to take down this show. They haven't figured it out yet. They really want to take down Andor and delegitimize it and its message and its story, regardless of its content, actually in spite of the content. But the same thing that they've done with The Acolyte and other shows. But in this case, I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing on any of our social media algorithms some of those very same voices that try to stoke resentment and division whenever we see a queer relationship, trans folks, people of color with prominent storylines. I wouldn't be surprised if they use this moment to start trying to turn people against this show and then therefore not hear its powerful message.
Yes, and that and to so that means to be considerate and critical about where you're getting messages from, because we really, truly, guys, there was organized and funded disinformation around pop culture properties that has happened in the past to manipulate people's opinions for political ends.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one would be The Last Jedi. People. I remember watching in real time. There was a lot of like bots and all that kind of stuff, and then there was research later saying that they stoked that with The Last
Mhm.
Jedi. And I think I have to respect Tony Gilroy a lot because he knew this was the last season. He was only getting 2 seasons, and the last season he was like, "Well, what are you gonna do to me? You're gonna give me a ticket? You're gonna arrest me? I'm gonna put lesbians in the show. The show's ending anyway." And like they put gay people in they put a trans actress and stuff like that, and the showrunner is a gay person of The Acolyte, and then The Acolyte got absolutely massacred for this. And Andor basically has a leg up because it's like, well, the show's ending, so what are you gonna do? And I have to give them their props for that. And the crazy thing about Andor is already there's this one guy, I'm not gonna say his name because I don't want to give him attention,
Sure.
but any Star Wars fan who's been on Twitter, YouTube, anyone knows exactly who I'm talking about, who he has flailed trying to find faults in this show, and everybody and their mother is like, no, actually, this is kind of the best thing since sliced bread, shut up. And watching the fandom menace, as we like to call them, flail trying to find like, I remember last season they complained about, oh, there's too many bricks and screws, and people were like, that's what you felt like you're grasping at straws because you're like, damn, I hate the woke Star Wars show. So you're grasping at straws. So like what Anthony was saying of like, they're going to try and find anything, they're losing with this show. I do think that the show having a specific endpoint and them not being able to like bully it off the air helps with that. But going back to how Alana said of like, and I think that's why we kind of wanted to get into this project or Project Fulcrum of, unfortunately, these pop culture products, as much as we love Andor and talk about revolutions, it is a product, are used as tools of the culture war in a way where if you talk to any man who's gone down the alt-right pipeline, the first thing he'll talk about is how they put a woman in Star Wars. Like,
Yeah. Mhm.
to the point where when I heard my nephew was watching a lot of Star Wars YouTube videos, I had to ask him some very
Which
important
ones?
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank God. Thank God my nephew who lives in Germany, I was like, little German boy, what videos about Star Wars are you watching? And he said, I found some of the things they said about women to be bad. So shout out to my 16-year-old nephew. Uh,
Wow.
Love that.
yeah, thank God. Whew, dodged a bullet there. But yeah, the culture war around Star Wars, I'm sure many people, it is very interesting in that it is used as a cultural touch point to the point where we can't have these nuanced conversations. And this was a problem I always used to have on my podcast of like,
Mm.
I want to criticize how, a show handles race in Star Wars or handles this in Star Wars, but or I want to criticize The Last Jedi for other reasons. But
Yes.
if I criticize The Last Jedi, like, and this actually happened to me. Like, sorry, this is a bit of a personal story, but when The Rise of Skywalker came out, I wrote like a Twitter thread where I was like, here's the reasons why I think this is bad about like women or about people of color or that kind of thing. Like, putting aside the story parts that I didn't like. And it went sort of viral. And then because the fandom menace loves to be like, and I hate this because of women and gay people and black people existing in Star Wars. The actor who played Chewbacca, like the new actor, harassed me on Twitter thinking I was the fandom menace. And I was like, no,
Oh,
I'm trying to have
no.
like a nuanced conversation about this. And you think I'm one of them? That's crazy. But it happens all the time. And I think a part of this culture war is that it silences any sort of nuance and conversation that we can have and calling in, ourselves, calling in our fellows on the left or whatever, because all the time we have to go, well, of course I like The Last Jedi because I think having diversity is a good thing. We can never progress past, I think The Acolyte good.
Yeah.
you know, because I think having black people star in something is cool. We can't have any nuance for anything. And I think that, again, bringing it back to Andor, I think that gets back to the whole thing of that, like, they can't have any disagreements about tactics between them because they're constantly trying to be like, well, I don't want the Empire to kill me.
Mm.
To think of it on that macro level. Anyways.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
I want to bring it back to speaking of like the way culture is manipulated around people. I want to talk about the ISB strategy and the Empire strategy on Gorman and as we see it throughout these episodes so far. Everything from
Yeah.
like literally trying to run an op on the rebels into baiting them with false information. But I also was struck how their plan, like we know that the ultimate goal for Planet Gorman is resource extraction, which is also, how empires run in the real world. But in the middle of that, they are literally building this armory in the middle of town as a provocation and to police people. And I was struck by how much that reminded me of Cop City, which is something that they're building in Atlanta
Absolutely.
and other police forces are building in other parts of the country. And like, there's the question of like, obviously, we don't want public money being spent on these things. They are bad. But how much is this a provocation versus just the ends of a means?
What we like to say in Get Free is that when we break down the strategy of the white supremacist faction in our country, they've utilized three primary pillars of this strategy: laws, lies, and violence. And
Mm,
so they create laws that dehumanize and control us and that justify their exploitation. And they create and spread lies, myths, and narratives that uphold the legitimacy of those laws and those hierarchies. And then they use violence to enforce it. And I think that those three strategies are things that we see very clearly with the empire and that we're seeing very clearly on display at Gorman, where their strategy is multifold and they're trying to create a scenario where they win in various of these scenarios. They are creating laws to further restrict the Gore. They're spreading lies against Gormans in order to ultimately justify and delegitimize the people there and justify their repression. And they're using violence. They're creating more and more of these armories, more and more of these weapons and what have you, in order to ultimately control the population until they've extracted what they need. And so I think that this moment that we're at in the show is where we're seeing this strategy in process. And of course, what many of us are unfortunately expecting is we're still going to see the end result and end game of what that strategy has for the people of the planet.
I think one interesting thing you guys brought up was about all these different tactics that they're using, and one thing that Partagaz mentions, when talking to Deidre is that he's like, "Oh, well, Cyril can't know what we're really trying to do here, and what we're really trying
mm,
to do here is use Gorman as a way to lure in other rebel factions like Luthen." For Deidre, it's that she wants to get Cassian because she's got personal beef, but it's really it is bait. And speaking on it's similar to that tactic of, we do a million different things. And the other thing that Partagaz said of, like, you gotta let them win a little bit so that they feel like they're doing something. I feel like that's something we see in real life all the time of, they let you win a little bit so you feel like you're winning, and making all of, the voices standing up to you look in one way so that you can find the people who are speaking out is a thing we're watching happen in real time, which is terrifying.
I mean, I don't actually think that the coordination levels that we see in this show of Empire's strategy are what we see playing out in the real world at all times. Like when people have concrete victories against oppression in the real life, you're not just being allowed to have that because they're trying to make you feel good about yourself. And I think in the situation of total control that you see in Star Wars, which is beyond what we experience in our lives today, thank God, it's a different, like, I'm not saying it's implausible, but for that world, but the sense of total power and control, everybody being watched uniformly and all of that is not like a one for one metaphor. So that is just one thing I do wanna, like, flag towards. I mean, but I think within the world of the story, yeah, absolutely, Luthien, who thinks he is the most strategic and art strategic of all, is actually playing into the hands of what the Empire wants to have happen for Gorman.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the worry I have. And I think we're all gonna see soon. And I hope, fingers crossed, that one of our leaders, at least one, sees through some of these plans and ultimately, of course, is able to save as many lives as possible while also having this moment be a moral rallying cry for people across the galaxy to rise up for freedom. But right now, our Deirdre and that older guy, that's
I
That's our
still think of
boss
him
in
as Master
ISB.
Qyburn from Game of Thrones, which is such a
Oh,
great, right?
Yeah. I
What a
kept
great way
forgetting
to
his name.
move
I was like,
him.
"It's Partagaz." I was like, I kept forgetting his
Particle.
goddamn name. Also, I have to say, just as from a funny note, seeing Krennic and Mon Mothma have a diva off, but a
Mhm.
political diva off about historical moments of resistance. First of
Yeah.
all, I wish my boy Thrawn had been there because that's kind of his thing. That's kind of his thing is analyzing the history of art. But
Yeah.
that's fine. I wanted to see the blue man in his dress uniform. I'm recording this today with fan art of Thrawn and Eli above me right now. He's my everything. But that conversation about the differences in how to see this historical event, and we were talking about, like, culture war or whatever, like, we see right now in how we talk about how they wanna remove DEI or they wanna break down the Department of Education, and they wanna take away, critical race theory or whatever. Everything is critical race theory if you just mention history, and that kind of thing. Is like, it was right there in that conversation. Even though that conversation was like a cover for what Clea was doing, like,
Yes.
I
Thank
found that
you.
really interesting.
Yeah, people, like, need to give credit for the fact that Mon was definitely aware if Clea was there, some shit was going down, and did a wonderful job of keeping everybody's eyes on her instead of, what was
Oh,
happening in the
yeah.
other. Like, I just feel like nobody in fandom gives her fucking credit. But anyway,
Mon,
that
I'm
yeah.
I'm here. I'm
I
here to
know,
give
you
all
get
the
it.
credit to
You
Mon.
get it.
And, like, you know
I'm her and Clea, I'm their biggest fan.
Yeah.
I'm at the door.
and I would add that, like, one, again, doing it in style, but in that whole moment, she's not only giving cover for the instrumental thing that needs to happen in that room, i.e., removing that listening device. She's also debating what by setting the terms of the debate. What I loved in that
Mm.
scene is she's not just negating and refuting what the Imperials have to say, what their storyline is. Instead, that moment is on where I'm like, oh, she's growing. She's not just
Mm.
rebutting with facts, she's actually rebutting with values. She's saying, actually, this is my worldview, galaxy view. This is the galaxy
Uh-huh.
view of equality, of what it means to treat people as equal beings. This is right, this is wrong. And she's moving the debate rather than and have making Krennic and them having to respond to her, which is just another lesson for
Mm.
us as people who believe in those values and are fighting for them here. We don't want to just be on the defense, responding to what our opposition's always doing. We want to be able to set the terms and ultimately make them have to be countering and feuding our story.
Which I love framing it that way because, the thing I was talking about earlier about how the the right-wing Star Wars fans, the fandom menace, like, they don't even know what to do with this show. I feel like that is Tony Gilroy doing what Mon Mothma is doing, like you're saying, of,
Mm.
like, setting of, like, "No, actually, we're gonna come out swinging. We're not gonna always be on the defense, and you have to respond to this," which I find so refreshing, and oftentimes
Mm.
that's a lot of my issues with the Democratic Party, where I'm like, all you do is defense. Let's have some offense, diva, um,
Right, right.
kind of thing.
And when MAGA Republicans come out and saying that they're doing all these anti-DEI attacks, instead say what they're doing is trying to reimpose segregation. What they're trying
Mhm.
to do is drag us back to the 1800s. What they're
Yes.
trying to do is steal the wealth our work creates so that they can allow a wealthy white few to rule over us. Like, set the terms, fight, and say instead what we're fighting for is real freedom and real equality.
Great advice for our listeners when they're having conversations in real life, for real, thank you. It also, like, noted to me how the opening of the ISB meeting from the beginning of the season, Krennic is saying that we're doing all of this project to get to the power source material on Gorman because the Empire has a vision of unlimited power. And Claudia pointed out to me that unlimited power is one of the various things that the emperor babbles in his fight in the movie, incoherently. And I was just like, oh, this is like sane washing what Trump says when, like,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, and speaking of sane washing, that really connects to the most powerful quote in these episodes to me, which is when I believe it's Saw who says,
mhm,
"Revolution is not for the sane." When it's like, and this idea of, I know that the word woke has been taken out of massive context for the past few years, But the idea of like, if you are woke and you are awake to the realities of what is going on around us, you feel insane, and you feel insane to the point of action. I mean, yes, there's a point of like maybe you're huffing the fumes a little bit, but like you feel insane to the point of action. And this feeling of what's interesting is it connects to the point of what someone like the emperor, someone like Trump, someone, anybody is doing of like, actually, they're the crazy ones. And
Mhm.
I hate to use that word because it's a little bit ableist, but irrational. They're the ones who are literally off the deep end. And sometimes with Trump, you do have to wonder about his mental stability. But that's the thing, is that like, no, actually, they're the ones who are, what they're saying is literally irrational.
Yes.
Well, on the flip side, it's like, oh, in order to take some of this action, you have to be a little crazy yourself. Speaking on the ableist thing, you have to be perceived as a little crazy yourself. That actually is the
Mm.
sane, rational reaction to this insane shit that's happening. Other people are going to perceive you as crazy. At least that's the way I took it. Rebellions are not for the sane. At least rebellions are not for people who are considered sane. Everyone around me, like my mother or someone, whenever is like, oh, you're just the crazy leftist who's always talking, whatever, she's always just saying things. And I'm like, actually, no, I like saw in the first season being like, I'm the one burdened with clarity of purpose kind of thing.
One other way to look at it with that line about revolutionaries is throughout our own history, the task of movements, of revolutions, whether it was the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, our task is always to change the common sense. And so for us, we're already starting from a place where our opponents, so if we look at the abolitionist movement, our opponents had, in the white supremacist faction, had created an order of society where Black people were not seen as equal human beings. And so the abolitionist movement, then, the revolutionaries of their time, had to come in and make popular, make common sense, introduce the idea, reintroduce really, that Black people and every person, men, women, etc., are equal. And that is, when it's not the common sense, that is a not very sane idea for the
Mhm.
mainstream. And then the other way I would look at this is that people who are willing to, and there are millions and millions of our ancestors who've done this, who've taken action, are people who have the audacity to dream and believe that we can change our circumstances. And if that quote is referring to that, I will proudly brand myself with it.
Well,
Absolutely.
they literally invented a term. I mean, all psychology is invented, but like the extra bonus invented a term during the time of the US Civil War for the so-called delusion that Black people have of equality. And like they would, doctors would diagnose Black people who sought freedom and equality with a mental disorder. So like they have a term for it. I forgot what it is, but like that very much backs up like who's defining those terms. But I mean, again, like with Saw, he's also literally high on his own supply. So that's
Well, technically,
yeah.
it's not his own supply. They're siphoning off from other
True.
people.
True.
I'm still confused if that is a drug supply then, and or a
No,
No,
it's
bomb or
fumes.
both.
it's gas fumes. It's like when
Yeah.
people are like, I kind of like the smell of gasoline. It's like
Mhm.
that. And he's
Right, right.
huffing gasoline because the rhydonium is the same thing that they're fracking Gorman for. And he's like, I'm just gonna siphon. And so he's just siphoning from existing pipelines so that they're. I also found it interesting that Saw's group is so focused on the nitty gritty day to day. They're having this big success because they're like, oh, now we can get fuel for our ships to do things. All of that was just to be able to get fuel without having to find ways to buy it and steal it and whatever all the time. They're like, oh, now we can directly siphon it off of that, whatever. I'm like, they're focusing on like day to day resource stuff in a way that, you know, Luthen's already handled that with funding it through the art and through Mon Mothma's money
Uh-huh.
and that kind of thing. Meanwhile, we're watching them be like, okay, how are we going to get gas? We could siphon it.
That's so true. Do you have thoughts about the fact that Saw Gerrera's troops are always portrayed as being largely non-humanoid? And
Oh, I have many thoughts about
yeah.
that, Alana.
Me too.
Um, For those who may or may not know, a key thing that George Lucas included, but maybe didn't include enough in the movies, and then was put a little bit more in the Clone Wars, was that the demonization of non-human people, who are the marginalized class in the Empire, was a part of the propaganda against the Separatists in the Clone Wars. So most of Palpatine arranged it so that a lot of the worlds that had beef with the Republic, justifiably so, because the
Mhm.
Separatists are pretty right on a lot of things, were non-human, largely non-human worlds, and most of the Separatists end up being cyborgs and non-human races, and then the enemy of the Republic are non-humans. And there's a thing about homogeneity, which is it was kind of like a reverse engined way. It was a reverse engineering of why the Empire was only humans in the first few movies.
Yeah, it's so smart.
But that was a thing, and this is also something I love about the Thrawn books, where they talk about how Thrawn is a race traitor. While there are no Chiss in the Galactic Empire, he's one of very, 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 very few non-humans in the higher echelons of the Empire, and he deals with racism within the Imperial Academy and stuff like
Yes.
that. And there's reasoning for it that goes back to how the ISB works and how all of this, all the way back to the Clone Wars of they made it so the enemies were non-humans. So of course, the people who have been in it from the beginning, like Saw Gerrera, we basically have Saw as one of the only humans from Andorad, and then most of the other people are from marginalized, formerly separatist, non-human majority planets. And I also found it really interesting that some of the senators that Mon Mothma was talking to who were like, I don't know, they were like the neoliberal non-humans. They're kind of like, and it's hard talking about race and ethnicity in Star Wars because it's not one to one, but non-humans are the marginalized class. And I think that of a lot of the people who are like, we need to just get shit done on the ground of Saw's faction are all people who've been marginalized since the Republic, and those were all mostly non-humans, which again, I find very interesting.
Yeah, that's one storyline that I wish and I still hope is brought out more in Andor is, yeah, the fact that so many beings in the galaxy who look, live, and love differently
Aw.
than, white imperial human men are bearing the brunt, first and foremost,
Mhm.
of the imperial hierarchy. And I think that, well, one, I want to give a shout out actually to Chris Kempshaw, who's the author of The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, through Beaumont Kim, successful resistance New Republic era historian who's looking back about the rise and fall of fascism in the galaxy. There's an incredible set of chapters, harrowing. It's strange to say incredible because it's about such horror, but it's about the speciesism, the genocides, the constructed inequalities of the empire, and how ultimately the emperor at all relied upon that in order to divide and rule. And the connections, of course, to our real world couldn't be ever clearer in this moment in our country and across the world, where we see supremacist factions and regimes use this same old playbook of demonizing, dehumanizing, and othering people based on what they look like, based on where they come from, based on where they go to pray or what have you, ultimately in order to justify mass exploitation, segregation, repression, and allow the 1% to hoard wealth and power. And so I think that, one, listeners, pick up that book. It's incredibly important.
Mhm.
It hits so deeply because of the current political moment we're in. And I think that when it comes to what we do see on screen or what's not on screen in Andor, is the full scale of the hierarchy that the empire has created and how that's going to be used in its propaganda going forward as well. It's also an opportunity for us to look at our own country and see how the MAGA regime and its predecessors have created a hierarchy of human value in order to justify a handful of people ruling over us. And so this weekly manifesto from NEMIC and those forthcoming are going to include calls to action and the such for you to get involved and to fight for real equality. And we'll be talking more about, how the connections between Andor and our real life and what we can do about it.
Yes, folks can sign up for that newsletter by going to
bit.ly/Project Fulcrum.
with P and F capitalized.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would
Yep.
really love to get people here subscribed to NEMIC's weekly manifesto. Because certainly when you guys were watching season 1, you probably were thinking to yourself, if I could get a weekly manifesto from NEMIC, I would. And now you can, you see. So get on that.
Well, so excited to be having these lovely conversations with you, Alana and Claudia, and really, really grateful to have y'all as part of the leadership team for Project Fulcrum with Get Free. So for listeners, again, if you want to receive NEMIC's weekly manifestos during the rest of the show, if you want to plug in to our lively Discord, where fans are
Oh,
having
yeah.
lots of discussions about the politics of Andor and how it relates to real life. You can sign up at bit.ly/Project Fulcrum. P and F are capitalized, or you can go to getfreemovement.org and check out the sign up page there. We'll be sending out the next NEMIC Weekly Manifesto on Thursday. So you'll get that in your inbox and you'll get invites to the Discord. And a sneak peek is we're going to be having a call to action this week focused on how you can take action or support others in taking action this graduation season. A lot of colleges are about to have those ceremonies, and we've seen the MAGA regime trying to whitewash academia as part of its agenda to control our lives and futures. And so what we'll be asking people who are students, who are new graduates, who are recent alumni, is to show that you're refusing to comply and demanding that their leaders of their universities refuse to comply with these attacks, with this white supremacist agenda, by standing for academic freedom, standing for civil rights, standing for real equality. And you can do that just by holding up a sign at graduation during the ceremony saying exactly that: graduates for civil rights, graduates for academic freedom, graduates for real equality. And you can share and tag those photos with Get Free. We want to get as many people as possible to demonstrate the vast public support and power we're building in support of our values in opposition to going back to the 1800s. And
Yeah.
so I encourage everybody to sign up because you won't want to miss this and other future calls to action.
Thank you so much. For more Graphic Policy Radio, don't forget to subscribe to Graphic Policy Radio. We will be covering the rest of the series and the finale in the coming weeks, and you don't want to miss it. In fact, I know you're probably thinking to yourself, how come you haven't talked about COINTELPRO or the Gormont Front and parallels to post-revolution France? Let me assure you, we are aware. And that is exactly the kind of additional history and context that we look forward to covering as we cover the rest of the season. So that's Graphic Policy Radio, wherever fine podcasts are listened to. And you can follow me on Blue Sky. My handle is Levin. That's my last name, Levin. And as we like to say, keep it geeky. And as Star Wars likes to say, rebellions are built on hope.